Please join me in welcoming Sheryl Cababa.
Thank you, Lee. Lee is a good friend. We've known each other for literally decades now, and I'm so excited to be speaking at Creative Mornings for the first time. Let me just test my little clicker here. So as Lee was saying, I really believe in the idea that innovation is not kind of silver bullet things that happen, but it's more like the incremental things that we do in our day-to-day work. So when I, think about this and what I want to share with you today, I'm not necessarily going to talk about, case studies of my work or anything like that, but more about the kinds of tools and frameworks that I think could be useful and usable for you to think about innovation in your personal life, in your career, in your work, in your organizations. And hopefully you can walk away with something that you might be able to, bring into a space of reflection over the coming days or months. A little bit about me. As Lee mentioned, I run a design studio with two partners called Optimistic Design. It's a studio, we're mostly based here in Seattle, and we do a lot of work in social impact with social impact investors. This is my team, a picture of my team from last year when we went to South by Southwest, so small but mighty kind of organization. And the things that we're focused on is applying human-centered design to things like investment strategies. And that's a little bit of a different space from where I started my career, which was as a product designer and an interaction designer. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So a few years ago, it was 2023, so 2 years ago, I wrote a book called Closing the Loop, Systems Thinking for Designers. And the catalyst for this was I felt like a lot of my practice, especially when practicing user experience design and human-centered design, was kind of falling short for the kinds of problem spaces that I was working in. Someone told me after I wrote my book, they said, oh, sometimes authors, they write the book that they wish they had. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that was a thing people did, because that was a thing that I was doing. And that just happened by accident, but that was truly the case. I felt like there were a lot of resources around systems thinking, which I devoured to figure out how to integrate this into my practice. But I never saw anything that was kind of the intersection of the kind of work I was doing as a designer and integrating systems thinking directly into my practice. How many of you work in, let's say, user experience design? Okay, a few of you. Yeah, so there might be some ways of approaching this that might be familiar to you. Also, do you all have paper and a pen available to you? Okay, great. We're going to be using that a little bit, and don't worry, it's a very no pressure situation, but it's more about kind of taking some of the things we talk about in a little bit and applying them. So I'll give you a little bit of background. So rewind, maybe about 10 years ago, I was working as a design consultant, and I've been working as a design consultant maybe for the last 15 years, basically as a user experience consultant, and doing design research and strategy. And I was doing an interesting array of projects that in a few different sectors. So I was working on projects in tech, oftentimes specifically emerging tech with large technology companies. And then at the same time, I was doing a few projects in global health or global development, and also some civic design projects were in the mix. And these are projects that ostensibly had very little in common aside from the use of human-centered design as an approach to problem solving. And so where I started thinking oh, is this kind of falling short in some ways? In tech, I felt like the problem solving and innovation was really oriented towards the success of a product from an individual user perspective. So if you think about you're designing an app and you want to use it, a lot of the research and consideration in the design has to do with you directly using the product and not necessarily about the context in which the product is being used and maybe the potential harm that could happen as a result. And that seemed to leave potential problems out of the equation. So for example, how marginalized populations could be harmed by products, predictive policing algorithms or races, they need to be dismantled. This is an article in MIT Technology Review a few years ago. Or how lack of familiarity with cultures could lead to tragedy, or how personal use of technology could connect to negative societal outcomes. And these are just to name a few. And I think there's like an inherent techno-optimism to how we design technology products. And then on the other side of the work that I was doing in spaces like global development, it felt like HCD was too narrow an approach, despite good intentions towards positive change and outcomes. So unlike tech, it does feel like a space in which people are often thinking about multiple perspectives, like end users, funders, policymakers, implementers. But in the spaces in which I was working, the HCD approach often meant reducing innovation to a singular, seemingly silver bullet, like technology device-centered solutions. And a lot of the work felt a little bit like, do you guys remember one laptop per child? I don't know if any of you remember this. It was in the mid 2000s, and the idea was, let's give a laptop to like every child, particularly like children in resource poor communities in the global South. This project just like failed miserably for many different reasons, but I think I associate it with the hubris of technologists, where there's this idea that if you design the device right, or if you design the thing right, the rest of it will just kind of fall into place. But there are all sorts of problems, like they didn't think about the energy context in which these devices be used. They didn't think about things like ownership context. Like not everybody thinks like the thing that I have is the thing that I own. There's lots of communities where things are shared property, and they hadn't really thought that through. It was like kind of like what I call parachute design, where you're like parachuting from another community and just like going in and designing something, and then it will never work because you've never really worked with the communities to actually do it. And then likewise, I remember working on a civic design initiative where we were coming up with all sorts of different things. It was kind of like a systemic view of the problem space, and basically kind of like came up with like, here's a bunch of like different services that you could offer. And unfortunately, the team we were working with was like, in order to get more funding for this, kind of needs to be an app. And it was just like, what? Oh, okay, I guess like we'll just have to do some app screens and you can get that funding. But this started me thinking like, oh my gosh, there's such a failure of thinking about where impact can truly be had. And it's not necessarily by designing like a screeny thing. It has to be at these different points of intervention within the system. So much of my work, and if you know me, you know this ends up in every single one of my slide decks. It's a cartoon that says, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And this is what it sometimes feels like working with technology companies and people who are actually trying, in good faith, trying to make positive change, but they can't see beyond their own like sphere of control. And so we think about problems in the way that it's just like, what is the thing that I can do about it immediately, and how might I normally solve for this? It reminds me a little bit, wait, I'm going to skip over this slide because I'm sensitive about time. This quote from Widen in an essay that he wrote several years ago, specifically about Uber and the systemic impact it's had on cities and transportation. He said, "We can't think of ourselves merely as disruptors. When we take on a challenge, we have to commit ourselves to producing complete, viable, and sustainable solutions. We have to finish the whole job." And this is how I think about like problem solving and the power that I as a designer have as a problem solver. So my career has kind of moved from this idea of being a UI designer to a product designer to an experience designer to a design researcher and strategist. And what happens along the way is you get involved earlier and earlier in the decision-making process, which means that this is a space where you can potentially have greater impact. I might not be shipping things, but I might be involved in like business strategy. And I felt like as somebody who wants to think about systems and how to change that, that's where I want to be. And the other thing that happens along that process is that I end up moving from the idea of being a designer as a producer, producing artifacts, producing digital things, to the designer as a facilitator, facilitating other people's ideas, other people's expertise, and bringing that into the fold in terms of like, where can we have the most impact? And so much of my job now is about making the invisible visible, showing how things are interconnected, showing how there's cause and effect that goes way beyond what we think it'll be. And like, you know, there's first order, second order, tertiary effect, and it's like cascading, right? And then the system as a whole, the concept of wholeness is that you are looking at a system, again, beyond your sphere of control. And I think the tools, like the direct tools, like this all sounds like really abstract and kind of like, how do I even integrate this? But if you're a visual thinker and you're somebody who has, you know, creative energy, I feel like a lot of times that means doing things like mapping. I love mapping things because I think very spatially, and these are ways of like making sense of things that otherwise might be hard to understand because they're abstract. So I have a couple of prompts for you, and just kind of like think about this. We're going to be doing a Q&A at the end, but kind of my two key questions are, how might we apply these ideas to ourselves, our relationships, our practice and career, and to the things we care about in the world? And how might we be thoughtful about making change for ourselves and in the world? And, you know, just let's see if, like, I'm very curious if any of kind of like the tangible tools that I'm about to share might resonate with you in terms of that kind of problem solving. I love this kind of framework around what defines contemporary problems. Is from Case Dorst, who wrote this book called Frame Innovation, which is about, you know, integrating systems thinking into innovation and design. But he describes contemporary problems as open. It's difficult to know where the boundaries are. They're complex. There are many elements in relationships. They're dynamic. The problems change over time. And they're networked. Seemingly unrelated stakeholders or fields affect the problem space. And so when he wrote about this, and when I first read it, I was thinking about, oh yeah, you know, there's these spaces that we think about as wicked problem spaces. You know, things like the housing crisis in our city, or the problems with healthcare, or issues in education. But then I was doing some systems mapping for an organization where I had a friend there, and she was like, whoa, have you ever thought about like using some of these to like think about like, I don't know what, like your family relationships? Have you ever used this to kind of like think about like just like your personal career? And I was like, I haven't really, but that's super interesting because think about like your most complicated family dynamics. I mean, everybody here has some drama. I don't know if you, my family's like that, right? But I was like, whoa, this just doesn't only apply to something like the housing crisis. This can apply to difficult interpersonal things that you might be going through. Problems are open, they're complex, they're dynamic, they're networked. And why? Because it all has to do with people. And I think that systems mapping is a tool for making sense out of that kind of chaos that could be, you know, and it's the holidays, so I'm oftentimes thinking about just like, oh, what are the interpersonal dynamics with people I haven't seen in a long time? And so how can I map this in a way that could make things easier, could solve for things? So I ask you to think of a problem space you've been navigating lately or have curiosity about. Maybe write it down on your little pad of paper, or just keep it in your head. And just keep it in the back of your mind as, you know, I walk you through some systems mapping exercises. So there's a reason that mapping is both a visual way of showing analysis on shows and movies. This is from one of my favorite movies, Paddington 2. And, they're oftentimes described as like a big wall of crazy because it's just like strings connecting a bunch of things. But there is something about like sense making. Sometimes it can also be a way of showing like a descent into madness, but which can actually happen to you if you've ever so I've had to create some like really big systems map, and I think it just like makes me a little bit lose sense of reality. But at the end of the day, it's really about noticing. So it's noticing how you might be stuck, noticing opportunities for change, noticing things that are beyond your sphere of control. And you may feel stuck in one way or another, whether it's in life, work, career, relationships, and how we might think about these various problem spaces, thinking about the status quo and what we want to change. And we need to remind ourselves that everything is connected, right? Making that visible and tangible, and kind of understanding that there are different ways of looking at things. I sometimes think one of my favorite writers is Atul Gawande. He wrote this amazing book called Being Mortal about geriatric care. But one of my favorite things he's ever written is about how the systems at the Cheesecake Factory could be applied to healthcare. And as somebody who, my brother worked at this Cheesecake Factory for a while. He's a chef now, and he always reminded me hey, the Cheesecake Factory, did you know, is a scratch kitchen. They're not just like Olive Garden throwing bags into the boiler of sauce or whatever. They actually make everything from scratch. And I was like, that is nuts, because have you ever seen their menu? Their menu is 100 pages long. How do they do that? But it's a really complex system where they have everything down to almost like a science. And Atul Gawande wrote this amazing article for the New Yorker several years ago about how healthcare systems can learn through that kind of breakdown of components and that approach in order to kind of structure how to better organize these complex spaces. And I oftentimes think about that in my work is what can I learn from other domains that could be really interesting to apply to my work, especially as I think about systems. And at the end of the day, there's this gap. There's what we want to happen, the vision, mission, and values that we are pursuing, and then the current reality, what we have today. And in that space, I love that space is being described as a creative tension, because this is the place where you can have an impact. This is a place where you can use the tools available in order to make change. And so the way I think about it is you can start by considering a problem space, you can map it, and then you can reflect. And I think I meant to add here as well, then you can take action. You can consider points of intervention. But how do you kind of make a plan or gain a better understanding of a space in order to make change? So the two tools that I want to introduce you today, how many of you are familiar with the iceberg model? Do any of you use that? Oh my gosh, yeah, I love it. A few of you do. And then are any of you familiar with the features wheel? Okay, both of these I think are just really fun, and they have two different purposes for me in my practice. And the iceberg model is for unpacking the status quo and root cause. Futures wheel is imagining change and how it might play out. For me, using tools like this is kind of it's kind of like doing laundry. Yes, I know, stick with me, okay? So, you put it in the basket, and then it's for me, it's I have this basket of disorganized clothes, and then I'm just putting them into the little piles. I love folding laundry. I hate putting laundry away. But it's kind of oh, you're making sense. It's kind of it feels like a similar sense-making exercise. Oh, I'm putting all the socks in one pile and all the t-shirts in another pile. When you started out with this kind of jumbled mess of things and ideas and maybe kind of ambiguous. So I'll talk first about the iceberg model. It's one of my favorite systems thinking models to use because it's dead simple, and also it can apply to many different things. So you're literally starting with what's at the top, which is an event, and then you start thinking about the patterns and trends, what has been happening over time that may cause that event to happen. Underneath that is the structure, what's influencing the pattern behavior, and then at the very bottom, and most interestingly, is our mental models. What beliefs stimulate the behavior? So I have a very simple example here, which is like, let's say the event is catching a cold. This is like a personal thing that can happen to you, and you might just be like, well, I catch a cold, I take Sudafed or whatever. But if you analyze it like this, some interesting things emerge. The patterns and trends, what trends have there been over time? Are you catching more colds when sleeping less? Underlying structures, what has influenced the patterns? What are the relationships between the parts? More stress at work, not eating well, difficulty accessing healthy food near home or work. And then the mental models, what assumptions, beliefs, and values do people hold about the system? What beliefs keep the system in place? Career is the most important piece of our identity. Healthy food is too expensive. Rest is for the unmotivated. Okay, that's where things get interesting, because if you're thinking about like, where in here can I create impact? It's not reacting to the event. I caught a cold, so I'm going to like drink some ginger tea. You can do that. I love ginger tea. But what happens when you really think about like, what's the deal with my career? Like, why do I, give it this kind of level of importance where it's affecting my health? Or how come rest, we have this cultural perspective about rest being for the unmotivated? Why are these things linked? And these are the spaces where you can start thinking about like, well, how can we change that? How can we change that so that we can have, future changes where we don't get as many colds, among other things. So we're not gonna have like time to like do this in super detail, but use your little pad and paper. I encourage you to draw a little iceberg. They look easy to draw. I find them really hard every time. I will be doing this in workshops like maybe once a month or something, and it's just like I still don't know how to draw an iceberg. So don't feel bad if your iceberg just looks like a kite or something. So start with your problem space. First, identify an event. What is something that you're seeing that is notable in your problem space? Like, what are these things that are visible to you? And you can think about like, okay, let's say you're using a kind of a big societal problem. You're using like the housing crisis. Like there are things that are visible about that, right? Like rent is too high. There are a lot of unhoused people like in our community. And then you can go down from there. Or you can say like, why does my mom always criticize me for whatever it is your mom criticizes you for, or your dad? Complex relationships with parents are a good use of the iceberg too. Patterns and trends. What is recurring over time that might lead to the event? What are the institutional structures, policies, norms, or ways of working that lead to the patterns? And then lastly, what are the deeply held assumptions, beliefs, attitudes, or culture that cause structures to function as they are? And what's nice about this is you don't have to like necessarily work your way down like in order. You can identify things at the bottom that might be jumping out at you about this, and maybe that already is a new lens for like looking at your problem space. This is an example from my work. Why are we having so much attrition in our organization? This is an organizational change project I worked on, and there's some stuff in the events level that's pretty straightforward. People moving closer home. This was like right after the pandemic had kind of eased up. But then things get interesting, especially when you get to the bottom two things, where it's like children are not old enough for a vaccine. There's a lack of childcare, lack of support for inflow-outflow within organizations. And then the mental models, work is my family, is shifting, changing dynamic of people's relationship to work. And this was really enlightening for the organization I was working with, because they were just thinking about like, oh, how can we just like create some like incentives, maybe it's around bonus time or something like that for people to stay, and weren't really thinking about some of the root cause things like they don't think you're like their family anymore. Like that is, I've always had kind of like a more transactional relationship with my work, but a lot of people have that perspective, especially when you've been told over and over again that your work organization is your family. And so this was interesting for them to actually articulate this during a workshop. So some of the benefits are that it's responding to root cause, it's focusing on behaviors and underlying mindsets, and it's broadening the problem space. So we can, we'll have discussion at the end, but how might this be a helpful activity for you? Do you find it useful in any way? The second one that I'm going to talk about is the futures wheel. I love this framework because it kind of puts all the assumptions out on the table and is often used for considering consequences, both intended and unintended. So this one too is dead simple. It's a model that helps you consider first order, second order, and third order consequences. Of events and trends, emerging issues, and future decisions. So you basically just draw something that's happening in the center or some decision you're making, and then you just go out from there. And you can do this if you're doing it at work, you can do this with your team, or you can do this with stakeholders, or if you're doing this as sort of like a personal examination, you can do this on your own. This is another organizational change project where an org I was working with was considering remote work. And there's a lot of obvious things that are happening in the first order effects, like an empty office, fewer casual connections, and then a couple of positive things like employee flexibility and access to a wider talent pool. And then it kind of gets interesting the further out you go. And it went out a lot further than this. I just couldn't fit it on the slide. But it's less defined centralized culture, or onboarding is more challenging, or there's increased productivity, but there's also employee burnout. So these are far more meaningful spaces for organizations to think about when they're making decisions. And also, these are things they can keep in mind and mitigate for them now, or be able to anticipate them when they do happen. This can also be used for things that are not necessarily decisions, but are out of your control. So things that are happening. Again, I keep talking about something like the housing crisis. You can put that in the middle of here. This was a map that you don't have to read it all, but this was a map where this strategist Barry O'Reilly put this on his website. He did this maybe 2 weeks after the COVID virus outbreak. And what's interesting about this is that there's just some things that ended up really coming true, even though this was just based on an exercise of, and then what happens? And then what happens? And if you go to some of the third order effects, it's mass loss of employment. People don't trust or follow health experts' advice. This is literally right after the COVID outbreak. Reduction in available healthcare workers, increased innovation to address health challenges. And not everything comes true when you're doing this exercise, but it does help you identify points where you can make change. So think about your problem space once again, and maybe you're thinking about a way to solve for something, or you're thinking about just something that's happening right now. And there are a few ways, just things you can ask yourself, what is a potential benefit of this decision or event? What is a possible harm caused by this change? After you identify a harm or benefit, what can happen next? And what might happen to different people? And how are people incentivized to act? I love the idea of trying to understand what are people incentivized by, and how can you kind of better understand that in order to make better decisions in your own life. So some of the benefits of Future Wheel is it's about avoiding harm wherever possible, mitigating for potential harm, and broadening your lens on what might be affected. And it's also good for anticipating unintended consequences, so being prepared for what might happen and watching for the signs. So I'll go back to this slide in a moment, but I'd love to have a discussion about this with y'all as we go into the Q&A. How do you see yourself using systems mapping in your work or in your life? Is there anything you're taking away from today that you find particularly useful? And are there other approaches or frameworks that you would like to share? The last thing I want to share is this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a famous Buddhist monk and activist. He said, when you plant lettuce, it does not grow well. You don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons it is not doing well. It may need fertilizer or more water or less sun. You can never blame the lettuce. And I'm not saying when you're thinking about problem spaces where you're actively involved in, that you don't have any personal responsibility or that individuals don't have personal accountability. But I think there's a lot of acceptance of self-responsibility or self-blame. Let's say work is not going the way that you want it to go. It's not just on you. There might be something that is systemic happening that you might not have thought about, and that maybe the system can change. So I do a lot of work in education, for example, and oftentimes there are these perspectives that come out from some stakeholders where it's like, oh, students now, they don't have any attention span, or they're lazy, or they can't read anymore, or what have you. And this is why education doesn't work. And it's like, well, what if we stopped looking at the students and started like wondering why that is, and who else is responsible for that, and how you can sort of associate that responsibility with those who are most powerful to make decisions. And so I think this, like, I always think about the lettuce and how, you know, it's not the fault of the lettuce. You need to look all around the lettuce. So thank you. And yeah, this is my book again. Let me know if you're curious about it. I have a copy of it if anyone wants to take a look at it. And yeah, thank you. Excited to be speaking.
All right, we have time for Q&A, and if you have a question, I would love to give you a mic so everyone can hear you.
Hi. Okay. Wow. This might be a really dumb question, but
There's no dumb questions.
wait till you hear it.
Okay.
It's so. This is so exciting, and as I'm thinking about all the opportunities to bring this to other people, I feel like the inevitable overwhelm rising up of like, oh God, now there's so many problems. So how do you anticipate that and mitigate that and go like, okay, we're gonna take care of our nervous system, and now that we see all these opportunities, prioritize? That has to be something you've dealt with.
Yeah, you just answered your own question in a way. It's like, yeah, you see all these problems and now you prioritize, and you can literally still be okay with being like, this is something that we can't do anything about. Like, this is an area that requires a lot more other kinds of intervention, that maybe, you know, it's not the one to focus on. Or, you know, if you're doing something that has to do with like your organization, or you're trying to make change in your community, you start involving people who can make that change. I sometimes think of this quote from Kris Jenner. Okay, like, I don't always quote Kris Jenner, but she and we never learned anything from the Kardashians, you guys. Come on. She once said, oh my gosh, now I'm forgetting it. No, she once said, if you're told no, you're asking the wrong person. And I'm like, you know what? I can have a lot of more of that energy in my life, right? Like, sometimes the way you make systemic change is like, oh, we're focused on the wrong person. Who can we call in who can actually be part of this and make a change, you know? Like, I'm pissed off that like my area of Seattle doesn't have enough bike lanes, and there are like whole organizations dedicated to not building bike lanes like in my neighborhood. And so it's like, we need the organizations, or like the collective action that can counter that kind of organization. So it's like, yeah, think about who else you can ask if you do want to make kind of that bigger change. But yeah, prioritizing keeps you from being overwhelmed.
Hi. I'm still processing a lot of what you shared, and I find it really stimulating. And the space that I'm transitioning into is the mental health space and working to become a clinician. And one of the things that really struck me when we look at the iceberg model is when you are looking at the place of transformation sitting in mental models. I think one of the challenges is how we internalize the systems, the layer right before, and how it's not just an intellectual experience when we're sitting in front of like a client. Oftentimes it's very somatic, it's very emotional. And so when I was looking at what you're putting up there for us to think about, it's like such a critical part of the process is disassociating or disconnecting or decoupling the mental model from the system to then even be able to work with mental models and not maybe feel like an innate almost existential dependency on the model for survival. And it then brings up a lot of feelings of complexity where you're like, how much of the system do I need to be here? And how much can I actually play around with the system and everything that comes above it so that I can maybe question it? And I find that to be very true culturally as an Asian American, seeing how my mom has kind of battled lymphoma treatments over the last year, how much she assumes the system is there to support her and her treatment. And then in the process of experiencing the system, questioning, wait, is this really true? Is it really advocating for the patient? And so I think one thing that's an aha for me is how do we almost like regulate ourselves when we're working with innovation? Because it's actually not that easy to uncover and go excavate the iceberg if we're not ready to almost face our own existential questions, which may actually be quite unconscious in the process.
Yeah, that's such a good comment / question. I'm sorry for your mom's experiences. It's like, so it really resonates with me as well. And I feel like part of it is, there's these like really internalized, there's these things we internalize that maybe don't even surface for us because it's so heavily internalized, and that might fall into that mental model space. And I think part of doing these exercises for me is like helping people to try to challenge the status quo, like try to challenge like why things are just the way they are. Recently, a car drove into a restaurant in my neighborhood. And I started looking into this and I was like, do you know how many cars drive into restaurants in this city? It's outrageous. One just happened the other day. I think it was like honey hole sandwiches or something like on Pike. And I was like, there are a lot of like, there's like a lot of like structure things that are the reason for this. One, that we prioritize the most dangerous form of transportation as a way of like taking up a lot of space in our cities, right? And there's a lot of structures that are meant to reinforce that. Speed limits that are too high, the width of the roads, the lack of pedestrian infrastructure. And I think it's like kind of taking like these kinds of like problem spaces. That's actually, that one is like interesting because that's like an event. Like car drives into a restaurant. Like, okay, what are the things like leading up to that? And one thing, like when you're working with teams that are doing these exercises, I find a really interesting question throughout this, and now I'm sad I did not actually have it on the slide, is like what the individuals even doing this exercise or the stakeholders involved, what are all of their incentives? How are they incentivized to act? Because they're not going to, some of them are not interested in changing the status quo. And so understanding that fundamentally and putting that in the mental model space is really super important, because then you can kind of understand like where are those barriers going to be. And I think it's kind of like, it's just surfacing, right? I think of these tools as like a structured way of having what might be otherwise emotional conversations. And I think of everything that's even like business decisions. Think about like the last like major business decision where you were like, what? That is a emotional decision. Like, listen, I work with a lot of executives. A lot of executives are like, it's all rational. It's all based on data. No, it's not. It's like all of your assumptions and whatever is gonna keep you getting the thing you want to get. And so keeping those two things in mind, I think is really important as you do exercises like this to really get to that, nugget of insight.
Hi there. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective on your processes that you go through. I would like to learn more about the models that you presented, and I guess what's your process in getting through those models? So do you put everything on the board all at once and then sort it out, or do you go through each stage with intention?
It really varies, and it depends on who I'm working with, because the like really useful thing about the framework is, you can just like give all the prompts all at once and slam everything onto the board if it's like an especially generative group, or you can go through it more deliberately if it's a group that is like needs that kind of structure. I notice, like, particularly in organizations where there's a lot of psychological safety, you can do the all at once kind of thing. But kind of like the walking through things is really important, especially for organizations where there's a big power differential, where people don't feel psychologically safe to speak up, and you might even want to like kick out like the leaders from that one because it will definitely be more interesting and get you to a more actionable space, I think. So those are the things to keep in consideration, like what kind of organization you're working with in terms of how you want to approach. I'm definitely not prescriptive about it because we do it differently depending on, who we're working with.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys.